Good evening, everyone. I believe we are live on YouTube, and I'm here with Odon LaFontaine. For those who are new, who don't know my name, and for those who regularly and routinely misspell my name, as Lollyd, Llyod, Lloid, Loid, it's Lloyd de Jong. And in fact, I misspelled my own name, as you see in the comment there. Yeah. But that's just par for the course. So because I was changing it at one point to too few Lloyds, because I thought that would be helpful. Yes, welcome everyone, and thank you, Odon, for joining me on this discussion about the Quranic Mushrikun.
My pleasure, Lloyd. Hello, dear audience.
Right, is that your new place behind you, Odon? It looks good.
It looks good, but it's only a temporary place for me. I'll move in my new place next month, and for the moment, everything is still in boxes, and it looks nice, but everything. I've got all my stuff packed, my books, and everything in boxes, and but I will move very soon, maybe at the end of next week.
All right. Yeah, well, that's good. Your place at least looks new. And yep, so Odon said he had a tough choice between reading a book, I'm not sure which book, I missed it, or joining the channel. So I narrowly convinced him to join me tonight rather than...
It's this book, the new Robert Spencer, Muhammad, a critical biography. Just received it today.
Okay, well, excellent, yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, so where is Thor God Odon? That's Adam Seeker. Welcome. Great to see you, Adam. And Daniel Alvarez, thank you very much. Says loving the content, much appreciated. Thank you. And by the way, I may have Hussein Mashni on tomorrow. I did reach out to him, and yep, let's see how that goes. So, guys, let's dive into the material that I have put together. Let's hope this shares without any issues. Okay, yeah, so this is where I ended on the last slide last time. Let's hope we can take a bit of a faster pace this time. So we ended up with the high God hypothesis, with Deism and Gnosticism. Now, without relitigating all of that, let's just mention briefly. So deists believe in a creator who does not intervene in the universe, which aligns with the idea of a high God who is transcendent, doesn't care about his creation. He's off doing his own thing. We are too small for him to notice. And this also is like the Gnostic monad. In Gnosticism, the monad is the ultimate ineffable, or otherwise inexpressible, indescribable source of all existence, often seen as distant and beyond human comprehension, which also aligns with Allah, the way Muslims describe Allah. The monad is not involved with the material world. And also, you must notice that in Deism and with the Gnostic monad, there is no personality to the supreme deity. They have no personality. They have no character. They're not a person. They're just something. Would you agree with that, Odon?
I agree with your definition, but I don't know whether we find this in the Quran.
Yeah, no, agreed. But Muslims will describe Allah as ineffable, nothing like humans. In fact, the exact opposite of the Imago Dei. We can understand God because we are made in the image of God, in the sense that we share his characteristics. We understand his attributes like truth, love, justice, and so on. So we are formed within that. What did you say? What would you say? Those characteristics, those parameters. Whereas Allah somehow is ineffable, while at the same time, you know, in Islam, he's got a vagina strapped to his leg. He's got one leg, maybe a shin, no legs. But he's nothing like the creation. He's completely unlike, completely opposite, and he's I don't know. Seems
it depends. It depends whether you're looking at the literal Quran or at the Islamic narrative. The Islamic narrative has developed the idea of a very distant God. But in the Quran, Allah is very human-like. He has emotions. He resembles what people would think God or gods are in the ancient times. He's a bit like Zeus. See, he has emotion. Sometimes he's angry. He's also like a bit like the biblical God.
Okay, so in other words, there's a conflict between the narrative and the text. And the plain reading of it.
In a sense, yes, because the narrative has sort of purified the text. It forces the Muslim to look at the text with a preconceived idea of God.
Okay. Yeah. So these are all transcendent ideas that are very characterless, transcendent ideas of the main deity. However, they are all separated from the mundane. Whereas, of course, you have in the Christian concept, you have God who became a man, who incarnated as a human man and entered into the mundane. And this is something that these religions disagree with. Right. So deriving a conclusion. So the classification of the Nasara, who are asserted in the standard narrative as early Christians, right, as mushrikūn. Now remember, mushrikūn means associators. It doesn't really mean polytheists. So there's a very woolly use of that term, a very imprecise use of that term. So, and this evolved in Islam's historical and theological discourse. So over time, these terms shifted. In the early Islamic context, some Quranic verses portray the Nasara in a favorable light, saying they were closer in faith to the Muslims compared to the Jews, like in Quran 582. In this context, they are not classified as mushrikūn. I'll do one more, then I'll hand it to you for comment. In later interpretations, in the early years, Christians, again, the Nasara, began to be viewed negatively. They were grouped with mushrikūn due to doctrines that were perceived to associate partners with Allah, such as the Trinity in Christian theology. Comment?
I think I've already said it, but the Quranic text is not homogeneous. And particularly, some verses are very distant in time. And the text reflects different situations. There was a time when the Nasara, the so-called Christians, were closest in faith to the Muslims. And there was a time, and I think it happened eventually thereafter, when they became enemies. But this will be the main topic of a future presentation from me about the Nazarenes, especially about the Nazarenes.
Excellent. Yeah, so there's a lot to be unpacked here. So historically, they were not classified as mushrikūn. Later, they were classified as mushrikūn in later polemical theological.
If I can add something, Lloyd, you see, there are many French translations of the Quran that your audience, of course, does not know about. And particularly, there are some Muslim translations that try to remain very faithful to the literal meaning of the Quran. And there is one made by Muhammad Hamidullah in the 1950s. It was the basis for the future Saudi-French translation of the 2000s. And this guy, Hamidullah, was a very faithful, pious Muslim. And he translated Nasara by Nazarenes and not by Christians. Because in some occurrences, it cannot be understood as Christian, especially in 582. In 582, if you translate Nasara as Christian, it completely contradicts the Islamic narrative.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Also, just an odd historical aside, the oldest Quran we have in English was based on a French translation. And that dates from like the late 1600s, I believe. So there've been French translations of the Quran from the Arabic into French very early on.
But before this, there was Latin translation from Petrus Venerabilis, Pierre le Vénérable, who was the abbot of the Cluny Abbey. It was I guess in the 13th century. And I think the French translations, the first French translation, were derived from this work, this early work. But there is something very odd with this translation. It has never been studied, this Latin translation. It has never been scholarly studied with modern tools in our times. And I think it reflects a different version of the text. So it's not the Hafs version. It's something else.
Very interesting.
But that's the thing with the Quran. There is no unique Quran. There were many variants, but it's not the issue here. Mostly the bulk, the gist of the text is the same.
Right. So, bit of speculation. What if the Quran is speaking about two separate groups, one of which has disappeared, and then later on new arguments appeared targeted towards another group that are given the same label, just as a possibility. Okay, so yeah, I'm not using PowerPoint. I'm using my browser because my desktop PowerPoint gave me issues. So now it's... Okay, so the Mushrikun are primarily identified as polytheists or pagans within the Quranic narrative, but they're distinct from Muslims, Christians, and Jews. They ascribe partners to God, shirk, and do not identify as followers of the Abrahamic faiths. But that is a contradiction. It's an inconsistency because later on the Christians are identified as mushrikūn. So the story is not by any means consistent.
And
so
there is another inconsistency, the one that Patricia Crone highlighted. She wrote, you remember in our first presentation, that the Mushrikun believed in the same Abrahamic God as the Jews and the Christians, according to the text, according to the literal Quran.
Yeah, we've covered that, I believe. Yeah, but that's why she thought of the high God thesis, because they didn't direct worship to him, just like the Gnostics didn't necessarily direct worship to the monad. They would direct worship to a deity / angel / whatever that was accessible to them or close to them or meaningful to them, or an aspect of the deity that was important to them.
It's one hypothesis. The other would be that the intermediaries Patricia Crone was referring to were priests or holy figures, holy Christian figures. And they were described as pseudo deities in the text, because the text is not objective. The Quranic text is not a report on the numerous faces, on a report on the Mushrikun, a report on the Nasara. It was not a journalist work. It's something else.
Yeah.
And there is a tone of critique. The text caricatures the face of the Mushrikun. So there might be more to, in the way they are described, they might be described as more associationists than they are, in order to caricature them, to slander them,
So it's a bit of exaggeration, propaganda.
Yeah, there's something of this, of exaggeration, propaganda. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So the term mushrikun apparently describes those who worship the same God, Allah, as the messenger, but they also venerate lesser deities who are seen as intercessors between themselves and God. All right. Now, you can see a parallel there with Christianity and Jesus, for instance, or you may think of Catholics, intercessors, saints as intercessors, and so on.
And there is another parallel to be made. You remember, in Judaism, in post-Second Temple Judaism, so in Rabbinism or Talmudic Judaism, there is this exact same concept of associationism, which is shituf, Hebrew shituf, and it refers specifically to Christians. Shituf, associationism, is the exact equivalent of shirk, and it refers to the Jesus divinity.
Okay, so let me continue.
And it predates Islam. it predates Islam.
Okay, now that's everything does, more or less. It borrowed from something that had to exist. So now the mushrikun or the polytheists acknowledge the existence. Oops. Let me just go back. So the mushrikun acknowledged the existence of the same God as the messenger, referred to as Allāh. So they accepted Allāh as the God of the Jews and the Christians, meaning they had a shared understanding of a singular divine being, of monotheism. Although it's what's not 100% clear is that whether they believed in this God as the supreme deity or just as a valid deity, but not their deity, so they didn't care. Right? There's a little bit of that. But they certainly knew who Allāh was. Despite apparent polytheistic practices, the mushrikun seemed to be aware of the biblical narratives and the concept of a sovereign God, which they identified with Allāh. So they weren't ignorant of the biblical narrative. And although they worshipped lesser deities, they recognized the overarching authority of the same God worshipped by monotheistic faiths. So they are strong for pagans. These have strong parallels with monotheism and with Christianity. So you see these odd syncretism. It might be syncretism, or it might be that the narrative that you are reading in the Quran is not true. So mushrikun, yeah, Odon?
Yeah, that's something when you talk about polytheistic practices, actually it refers to the Islamic narrative, but not the literal interpretation, the literal reading of the Quran. If you look at the Quran, there are no 100% polytheistic practices that are described.
There's no reference to actual paganism, pure paganism. In fact, all the Quranic references to paganism are historical, referring to Abraham.
There are some references, there are some interpretations within the Islamic narrative to the practice of the game of chance, for example, or divination arrows, or burying alive little girls, or worshipping Allat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza. But when you really look into it, when you look at the literal text, it's not about pagan practices, it's something else. It's something else. Apart from Allat, Al-Manat, Al-Uzza, there are just remnants of old, ancient pagan practices or pagan worships. But we have no archaeological evidence for any kind of worship to these deities during the 7th century. And I think the preacher that talks in the Quran only refers to these old deities to mock his Christian audience.
Okay. Yep. So mushrikun. So the beliefs of the mushrikun are described as described in the Quran show characteristics that can be associated with both pagan monotheism and Judaism, which is intriguing as it is. Now, pagan monotheism, the mushrikun recognize the singular sovereign God while also venerating lesser deities. So this aligns with certain forms of pagan monotheism where multiple divine beings are seen as manifestations of a single higher power. So here the divine is viewed as a spectrum allowing for the coexistence of a high god and subordinate deities, which aligns with Gnosticism, to be quite honest. It's very much the way Gnosticism views its pantheon. In Judaism, the mushrikun's acknowledgement of the, at the time, pagan Allāh as the same god worshipped by Jews and Christians indicates a connection to Jewish monotheism. So you've got these guys who somehow seem connected to these guys. So interesting parallel. They accepted biblical narratives and they recognized the authority of the God of Moses and Jesus, which aligns with the monotheistic traditions of Judaism. So there's this odd mixture of a singular God while incorporating elements of potential polytheism. However, which makes the identity ambiguous. However, when we say polytheism in this case, you have separate gods, separate entities. They're not friends. They're not related. Whereas we've mentioned here, there's this kind of monotheism where they believe in a single God, but he has spawned other deities that are part of him. So in other words, if you worship, imagine you've got the main god called Frank, and Frank has some tinier clones of him, and Frank has made a couple of clones called Justin, James, and Willie, right? So if you worship Justin, James, or Willie, they are part of Frank, and therefore you're not violating Frank's authority. You are actually still worshiping Frank, because these guys are part of Frank. They are aspects of Frank. They're not Frank. Hopefully that makes some sense. Any thoughts to that, Odon?
What you are describing is the concept of saints within Christianity. You worship God, and you also worship, for example, Saint Peter Abestepos, one of the first Arab bishops, or Saint Sergius, a missionary among the Arabs. And because they are saints, they are part of God, sort of. And they can be, from the outside, from the point of view of someone criticizing Christianity, it can be slandered as polytheism. You worship God, okay, it's the same God as us, but you also worship Sergius, Peter Abestepos, or other holy figures, and therefore you are polytheistic. Even
Right.
though the people he is criticizing are only Christians.
Right. Well, so Sandra asked, what happened to Albert? Albert's the monad. So I was talking to a slightly different concept than than Albert, the monad, the Gnostic monad. But there's an odd thing here again. We got to think maybe with a third world mind, not a first world mind, where you have different deities that are ultimately creations of the single deity, of the single monotheistic deity, but that guy has disappeared and no one's seen him for centuries. Whereas Willie is the guy that makes it rain. You see, Willie makes your crops grow. So therefore, it's okay to worship Willie, because ultimately it's an acknowledgement of Frank. You see, so you're worshiping a different god, but it's still the same god. So it it's monotheism. So they don't see a contradiction, that it's actually not monotheism. And that's important for later. I'll get to that later, but hopefully that makes sense. So the Mushrikun recognize the moral authority of the God of Moses and Jesus. They do. So they acknowledge the biblical narratives associated. So they are familiar with the biblical story, which means they may well be influenced by this narrative. However, this does not imply that they accepted Jesus' divinity or moral authority in the way that Christians do. Any comment before I go on, Odon?
Why do you say it does not imply that they accepted Jesus' divinity? You see, Lloyd, just to be clear with your audience, I am adamant on the Mushrikun being Christians. This is, I've worked on the literal text. I am very convinced of it. You have other ideas, nuances, and so on. So I won't bother you for every nuance, but for
if we look at the so when you say that the Quran, someone, the voice in the Quran, the narrator, is criticizing Christians, right? But also they present a false impression of Christianity. I mean, a largely Gnostic impression of Christianity. Many of these stories are from old 3rd and 4th century Gnostic myths, right? So the narrator is
but it doesn't mean that the people were actually Gnostics. They might have been influenced by Gnostic theories and Gnostic movements, of course, especially in Arabia, which was a sort of refuge for heresies.
So just think, though, Muslims accept Jesus, but they do not accept Jesus' divinity or moral authority in the same way that we do. They say, yeah, we love Jesus, we worship Jesus, we think he's a great guy. Jesus, that naked guy on a cross. Jesus, that guy who was born out of a virgin. Jesus, that guy who ate food and pooped. So they acknowledge him, but they don't. You see, it doesn't imply that Muslims even accept it. Understand? You've got a group, much like the Muslims, who say yes, but actually it's no. So it doesn't mean that these people worship Jesus the same way as Muslims, as Christians do, but they acknowledge him, but they don't necessarily treat him in the same way that of reverence that Christians do.
I still don't think this is not in the Quran. I stand my ground. I think the literal Quran describes the Mushrikun as Christians.
Yeah. No, look, the narrative certainly doesn't. I mean, the narrative makes one claim and talks out of both sides of its mouth. If you look at the narrative, then that's accurate in context of the narrative. So in Judaism, Jesus is not recognized as the Messiah or divine, and thus the acknowledgement of his authority by the Mushrikun would be limited to his role as a prophet or a significant historical figure rather than as a divine being. So now we're looking for parallels, because the Quran is not a confession. It doesn't go, well, this is what we did. It's giving you clues and hints, and you've got to build a hypothesis. So it can be interpreted that while they recognized the moral teachings of Jesus, they didn't necessarily accept his divine status or authority, which you could find a parallel in Judaism, and you'd find a parallel in Islam today. This aligns with the monotheistic view that acknowledges God as the sole authority, but attributes no divine status to Jesus, which takes us back to Judaism and also takes us to Islam today. So you see these parallels, old and new. So, because sometimes, and I'll have to explain it later as I go, but maybe not today, but sometimes I get the feeling there's a projection. The speaker is himself one of these mushrikun, and he's projecting his bias onto, let's say, the Christians, as you say. So it's actually a projection. So all the claims that everything he's accusing these other people of, he's guilty of, in that sense. But so the Quran has very few references to idols in contexts that are not related to biblical stories, like it's repeating these biblical stories. This is surprising given the historical context of Mecca, where it is supposed to have been that the Kaaba had pagan deities, hundreds of them, as well as a main deity called Hubal, also known as Allāh, Hubal being Baal, and was surrounded by numerous idols. So there are many limited references in the Quran, right? And these mainly focus on biblical contexts rather than current, at the time, local practices. So they seem to be retelling old stories, which also aligns with what the Quran says. He was retelling old myths, correct, Odon?
Yeah. In other words, without the Islamic narrative, it is very difficult to establish the Meccan paganism.
Say that again, please. Sorry. Oh.
If you don't refer to the Islamic narrative, it's very, very difficult to establish
paganism.
The paganism.
Yes, yes, that's what she says. Yeah, for sure.
But if you have the Islamic narrative in mind, everything you will read in the Quran will look pagan.
Yes. Yes, so there's a certain embellishment going on there. So historical context. So the Quran, there's a lack of mention of significant Meccan idols and practices, which means a disconnect between the Quran's narrative and actual idolaters' practices that were supposedly prevalent in Mecca.
Yeah, even more so than the very few practices, supposedly idolatrous practices that are described. So game of chance and divination, arrows, and stuff like this. We looked into it in our previous presentation. They are not idolatrous practices. It's something else. It refers to biblical practices. It refers to the Nazirite vow.
Right. No, she mentions it seems to be taking from another source and then talking about it from old biblical passages, Old Testament, and so on. Okay, so ambiguity. And we all know the Quran is extremely ambiguous. It alludes to things. It's not specific. It's not detailed. It alludes to it. It's extremely vague, so you can spin anything out of it. That is also that I think you can explain that in terms of the Gnostic allegorical method being infused into this thinking. So ambiguity in terms. So She raises questions about the interpretation of terms like Altan, suggesting that even when idols are mentioned, there is ambiguity about their significance and the context in which they are discussed. As a similar parallel, think about it. Mecca is only named once in the Quran, one time. And it's not specific. Oh, Mecca, the largest city in the world, the first city founded. Muhammad, you live on number 12 Smith Street on the corner of the chocolate factory and next to the shop. The Quran is just, oh, the Mecca where green things grow and the sheep are scared of the men. And you're like, okay. And that's the one reference. It's pretty vague. And you've got to figure out, is Muhammad even connected to Mecca? Or so understand that. Overall, the text indicates that the Quran's treatment of idolatry does not. This is Crone's text reflects that the Quran's treatment of idolatry does not reflect the reality of Meccan religious practices. So there's something missing or very inconsistent in its portrayal of idol worship. At least you nodded your head there, Odon.
I was thinking to something in the so-called satanic verses, but the one that have been taken out of the Quran, where Muhammad supposedly praises the worshipping of Allāh, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza. He calls them high-flying cranes, deities, with an expression that refers to pagan deities. And the fact that he's using this expression means that the audience knows about paganism, as if it just left paganism, or it was freshly Christianized. And so it remembered that their great-great-parents still worship pagan deities. So there is a sort of pagan background, but it's an old cultural background, but not an active pagan worship background.
Right. And also, I think that may be why Dan Gibson is so drawn to Petra, because that particular worship was centered in and around Petra. So I think that may be one of the reasons.
The thing with Petra at the time, Petra was a Christian city. There was a bishop in Petra. And Dan Gibson, I don't know whether he wrote it or maybe he did, but he should have given more highlight to the fact that there was no active worship in the 7th century of pagan cults, pagan deities in Petra.
I mentioned that basically in our opening slide. I mentioned that in the opening slide. There was basically no record of paganism in Arabia at the time.
I have an interview of Julien Christian Robin, who is one of the most proficient archaeologists in Arabia. He was allowed to do excavation in Saudi Arabia. He did a lot of research in Yemen and all of Arabia. He's a world specialist. He wrote in Le Coran des historiens, the Quran of the historians, so a reference book that was published 4 years ago in France, 5 years ago, that there were absolutely no active pagan worship in Arabia, save for Mecca and Medina, maybe Medina and Mecca, based on the interpretation of the Islamic narrative, but only based on this.
Okay.
But if you really look into the Mecca case, as Patricia Crone did with her book Meccan Trade and the Rise of Hagarism, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, you realize that Mecca did not exist as the Islamic narrative described it. Right. It cannot be. There cannot be agriculture and fishermen and so on in the Mecca that is described in the Islamic narrative. It can.
What do you mean, Lake Mecca no longer exists? Are you saying that the Meccan Lake of Galilee is dry? Someone pulled the bath plug on it? That is. No, I've been to that. I've been as close to Mecca as I can get legally because I've been around Mecca. and that area is dry. It's really dry out there.
But a Muslim correspondent once told me it's because there was a climate change in the Middle Ages. Mecca used to be green and fertile, and he doesn't know why. Maybe because Islam wasn't fully applied there. But the climate changed, and Mecca became a desert.
Oh, so Mecca became a desert, and these are 6-year-olds, by the way. So hold on, hang on. Let me just share something here. Let me share my full screen, entire screen. And not only was there climate change, darn it, it's not. Let me stop sharing in my screen shares, and I'll go back to sharing my screen. Let me share my entire screen rather than. Yeah, there was climate change that removed Lake Mecca, and these are 6-year-olds. I assure you, these are 6-year-olds from the 7th century. This is what 6-year-olds looked like in the 7th century, people. And climate change has made them become younger and younger and look like proper 6-year-olds today. Just true story. Excuse my sarcasm. Oh, by the way, for some reason, my desktop version of PowerPoint would not load. So I was forced to load this in the web browser-based version of PowerPoint, and it's corrupting some of the font. So that's why the weirdness, because for some reason I have to reinstall Office or something. Just briefly, Tagut and Al-Gibt. The definition of Tagut: false gods or idols worshipped alongside or instead of God, right? Allah. The Quran tells believers to stay away from these entities. So, of course, this would give us some reason for thinking that that's why there's a contradictory view of Jesus. On the one hand, they worship him. On the other hand, they honestly revile him. I mean, they are extremely nasty in reviling Jesus. So it's really odd, the cognitive dissonance there. And then also, messengers were sent to various nations to preach the worship of Allah alone and warn against the worship of Tagut, so idols. So now we go from worshiping the Trinity to becoming idol worshippers, and they call us idol worshippers. Now, personally, I don't think Odon goes out and licks his local crucifix, but I know people that go out and lick a big rock, and this apparently is not idolatry. Now that is completely contradictory to think about it, right? But also you can see now why they see us worshiping Jesus and thinking of the Holy Spirit and the Trinity as part of God, as being God, as idolatry, because this is what they are taught. However, think of the contradiction of how Muslims will literally, and I've shown the photos and we will again, literally lick and hug and rub themselves up against a rock. They will literally rub their sexual organs up against a rock and then claim that this is not idolatry, because remember what I said earlier? You had different gods who were not friends, they weren't related, weren't family, and there was maybe there was a big major single deity, but maybe the big creator guy, but he either got mugged, knocked unconscious, and he's lying in a ditch somewhere on a different planet, and he's not going to be seen for a long time, maybe ever, and therefore we have to deal with the gods we have, or the gods that we do have, that these pagans are worshipping, are part of the original God anyway. So if you worship Willie, you're worshipping Frank anyway, so it doesn't matter. Now, if you think of this way, that rock is Allah. So if you worship the rock, you're worshipping Allah. Therefore, it is not idolatry. It makes no sense to the Western mind. It is perfectly logical. It's Tuesday morning every day in the third world. Your thoughts on that? Hold on.
Okay, I understand the reasoning, but is this so blatant that the Islamic narrative was polluted with all pagan practices? Like
there's
this.
The Quran, there's the interpretation, and there's the words in the Quran, there's the interpretation of the Quran, and then there's people's understanding of what they think the interpretation is of the Quran, because they don't read the Quran, they listen to the scholar's interpretation of it. So there's like different levels of understanding here. There's not one understanding.
There's another angle to this topic of Arab paganism. We have the descriptions of the Quran, okay. We have the critical study of the Islamic narrative, okay. But we also have the sources from the late antiquity about Arabs, and they are described as being barbaric. They used to be pagans, but they are still seen by other Christians as barbarians with very rude customs, and they have kept pagan rites, and they are still said to worship stones, like the black stones or the white stones or other stones, and so they are seen from I don't know, from the point of view of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for example, as savages, maybe Christianized, but still savages.
Yeah, no, yeah. So the thing is, you can worship what is
at least some of them, maybe not all of them. But...
Yeah, no, there's it's a soup. I mean, we're trying to identify this. It's a soup. We're trying to identify the ingredients so we can separate them. We're trying to make distinctions, you know. But the idea that I'm trying to present here is that while they are literally doing what we would consider to be pagan acts, pagan practices, directly primitive pagan acts that we know historically are so, they don't see it as that, because in their mind, when I'm rubbing myself up against this rock and licking it, I am worshiping Allah, because Allah made this thing, therefore it is Allah, therefore it's okay. That is like the third world mind, and this matches with some of the idea of the high God. Now, of course, we come at this with an academic view from the Western world. Well, the high God hypothesis works exactly like this, and if there's more than a 1-inch deviation, then of course it's all wrong and we've got to ignore it.
I agree.
But the fact is, these are people that are not exactly what I would call educated geniuses, and they're all going to manipulate these ideas and present them and use them for their own purposes, for their own agenda, in their own way. That's why you have. So therefore, it's not going to conform exactly to the dictionary definition. Odon?
Yeah, and besides, within the Muslim population, in the first times of Islam, there were not. They did. Oh, excuse me. They did not all think the same. I want to refer here to the episode of the ransacking of Mecca by the Karmashians at the end of the 10th century. There was an allied faction that did not agree with the pilgrimage and with Mecca being chosen as a holy city. And they attacked Mecca, destroyed everything, poisoned the Zamzam well, and they took the black stone. They stole it. Because for them it was heresy, it was polytheism, it was paganism, and the caliphs had to pay a huge ransom to get the stone back, and they only got it maybe 40 or 50 years after the conquest of Mecca by this group, and so. We don't. Muslim cannot be sure today that the stone they are worshipping, actually the fragments of stone
is the same
that they are worshipping, are the actual, real, authentic fragments of the true black stone from the 7th century.
That's, does anything work right in Islam? Okay, so let me get through this slide very quickly and move on, because I have like a billion slides. So let me see. Crone contrasts the Quran references to idols with the historical context of Mecca. We've mentioned this, right? But within the narrative, there's a deep-rooted idolatrous practice, right? So now the Quran obviously challenges this practice, and Odon has said that maybe it exaggerates it because maybe it was more of a Christianized context, but it had to create this pagan context to give Muhammad something to do, right? Okay, then absence of idols. So the Quran does not mention the existence of idols, all right, in the context of the Abrahamic sanctuary, which leads us to questions about the portrayal of idolatry. It's not consistent. We've said that. And so there's a disconnect in between the history and the narrative in the Quran, and the narrative about the Quran. So there's three different strands here. The references to the cultural practice of idol worship, such as stroking idols before leaving Mecca, underscores the ingrained nature of these beliefs among the people. But then we might assume that these practices were real practices that were being repeated even if for narrative purposes, right? I'm busy working on a document, a presentation on the. Oh, no, I'll throw something at you while we're here. I'm busy working on something that examines the beliefs of the pre-Islamic Arabs, the pagan Arabs, right? Because there was paganism at the time. And I mean, there was paganism in Arabia, and I'm looking at the beliefs and what we know of their beliefs, because they weren't a written culture. At least what's crazy is there was a lot of writing going around. I mean, the Yemenis and so on, they were all written cultures. There's a profusion of languages, but somehow the Muslims come along and suddenly all writing just disappears. Poof. Mystery, right? And they're not a written culture when literally everyone they interact with is a written culture, but not these guys for some reason, which doesn't make sense, but okay, fine, let's go with that.
There was a huge, there were huge destructions of documents during the Arab conquest.
Thank you for saying
library of Ctesiphon, the library of Alexandria, but especially the library of Ctesiphon.
Okay, that would be Iraq. Baghdad, for those of you who are not that familiar. Close enough. Oh, we even need to look at what the word Baghdad means, where it comes from. But the point I'm getting to is that for a future show, what I've got is I'm working on the history of these Arab pagans and their beliefs and their culture and their beliefs and their attitudes. You mentioned they were barbaric, they were violent. This is actually captured in what we have of their poetry and their songs. And their prose, their stories, and this is how they retained history with a lot of embellishment. They would memorize these things. So does that sound familiar? So, and when you listen to these poems, to these stories, to these songs, these are violent, bloodthirsty, and extremely pagan, and they deal with demons. We now call them jinn. And you start to realize, man, these Arabs were very pagan and very brutal and very primitive. So that's something I want to get to.
Don't you think it very conveniently fits the Islamic narrative?
You think these were forgeries?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll go through some of these and we'll see, because they seem to, I mean, they do allude to a civilization that is kind of primitive, not exactly sophisticated, but let's go on. Okay, so before I get sidetracked, so Near Eastern Christianity and Sidney Griffiths. Let me just take this. Okay, so here's a quote that's very interesting, right? Now, quoted by Crone, nothing but mainstream Near Eastern Christianity is reflected in the Quran. Now, guys, I'm providing multiple different perspectives. I'm going through many different scholars, including Odon, whom I am considering here as a scholar. So I'm providing multiple different strands, multiple perspectives. So you can see there's a lot of different ways to interpret this, right? So there's nothing but mainstream Near Eastern Christianity reflected in the Quran. However, she points out that, her comment on that, no mainstream Christians of the messenger's time saw Jesus as a prophet to the Israelites, or denied that he was the Son of God, or credited him with the revealed book, or held him to have confirmed the Torah, took the virgin birth to mean that God blew his breath into a model, denied that the Jews had crucified Jesus, held his mother to be a Levite, nor envisaged Jesus as having been born under a palm tree. That's very important. That palm tree thing, that goes back to Jerusalem. And she concludes that the most obvious candidates are Jewish Christians. And that's quoted by Robert Hoyland in his paper, Patricia Crone, The Quranic Pagans and Related Matters. Your thoughts, Odon?
That's my conclusion, too. There is something very specific in the Quran. There is now religious claims that we don't find, we cannot find them anywhere else. We find traces of them in the ancient sources from the fathers of the church or from antiquity historians when they are talking about Ebionites or Jesseans or Nazarenes or Jewish Christians. But that's the thing with the Quran. It's not a copycat of something that was common at the time. It's something. It seems like something new because we don't know exactly the kind of religious current that fueled the Quran. Actually, I think it's not new at all. It pertains to Jewish Christianity or Nazarene Christianity. And I think Patricia Crone was right. The most obvious candidates for the influence, the religious influence of the Quran are Jewish Christians.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, so, because it's clearly not Orthodox Christianity presented in the Quran.
No, it's another Christology. So Jesus is not the Jesus of Christianity. It's another Jesus. He's Messiah of Israel, of course, but he is not God. He might be called Son of God, but not in the sense of being God himself. And that's something a bit confusing. In Surah 9, there is a verse condemning the Nazarenes, Nasara, for saying that the Messiah is Son of God. But actually, it was a common belief in ancient Judaism that the Messiah should be the Son of God. The big surprise with Christianity was that Jesus declared himself as the Messiah, as the Son of God, and as God himself.
Right. Oh, by the way, people are talking about Saint Murad. Saint Murad and I will be doing 2 streams next month. That's already planned. I think one on the 7th and one on the 14th of next month. So stay tuned. They've already been scheduled, but the details are forthcoming where you can see this thumbnails. And I'm hoping to have another one with Odon and Saint Murad next month. So let's see. But Murad and I will be on next month to discuss his Quran. And of course, if we have Odon's input, it's only going to be spicier.
Yeah, I also have a video scheduled with Murad on my channel. I will be releasing it on the 3rd of November for the official release of his translation of the Quran.
Right. Yep. And guys, if you like the content, please share it. Let YouTube know you like the material. Give it a like. Do subscribe, please, and tell your friends. And thank you again for all the support. And of course, support our guest. I mean, he adds incredible content and detail, and fleshes out a lot of what I have to say here. Okay, let's see. Mainstream Near Eastern Christianity. What is that? So, refers mainly to Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches, significant branches of what's called Eastern Christianity, and these come from Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. Eastern Orthodox Church, the largest body within Eastern Christianity, and it claims continuity with the original Christian church founded by Christ, emphasizes adherence to the decisions of the first 7 ecumenical councils, has a rich liturgical tradition, and the Eastern Orthodox Church views itself as the true representation of the Christian faith as practiced by the apostles and early followers of Christ. Fine and well, that's the Orthodox Church as we know the Orthodox Church. Sometimes when I say Orthodox, I just mean as in correct practice. And sometimes when I say Orthodox, I will be referring to the Orthodox Church. Hopefully you can tell the difference.
The best way would be to refer to them also as the Aramaic-speaking churches. Right. But since you include the Armenian and the Coptic, because when you refer to countries and regions, you forgot about Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Far East, the Far Eastern churches.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Okay, now you've got the Oriental Orthodox churches. These are the Armenian Apostolic Church and the Coptic Orthodox Church. Now, they separated from other Christian traditions after the Council of Chalcedon in 451 because they had different Christology. Just like we see a different Christology in the Quran, they had a different Christology, which led to their classification as non-Chalcedonian or monotheistic. Now, that word is loaded. There's a lot of history there, but let's not get too bogged down. Heterodoxy considerations. First of all, Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches have been viewed as outside of mainstream Christianity due to distinct theological positions. I wouldn't say strictly.
Let me just put something here.
Please.
There is no such thing as mainstream Western Christianity in this time. The vast majority of Christians were in the East. This is a very Roman-centered way of seeing Christianity.
Yeah. No, what I'm saying is that I'm going back, but just from the point of view now, looking back, we'd see it in that sense. But yeah, good point. Okay, so in terms of their conflicts with the Catholic Church, I'm kind of writing in that sense. Now, Eastern Orthodoxy considers itself mainstream within its own tradition, but diverges from Roman Catholicism or the Roman Catholic Church and from Protestantism. It understands doctrines such as the Trinity and apostolic succession differently. It rejects the papal supremacy, and it has a conciliar or council model of governance. Okay, Oriental Orthodoxy, often labeled heretical by other Christian traditions due to rejection of certain ecumenical councils and the view of the nature of Christ. Now, the Oriental Orthodox belief is that Christ has one united nature, which is Miaphysite or Miaphysite. So he has one united nature that is both fully divine and fully human. They reject the idea of two distinct natures in one person, as defined by the Chalcedonian definition, while also affirming that this unity does not create confusion or division between the divine and human aspects. How you can have them mixed and yet separate is kind of weird. We go with the Chalcedonian definition. So now I want to throw something at you. Muhammad is Jesus, right? And we'll look at the Gnostic Gospels as to why, and I'll explain this in a moment. Now, the Quran mentions the following figures with these frequencies. Muhammad is only named 4 times with additional indirect references and titles. Jesus is named 25 times with over 187 total mentions, when including indirect references and titles, like the Messiah or the Son of Mary. Moses is mentioned 136 times and Mary 70 times. Now, if Jesus were mentioned only 4 times in the Gospels, which is a text centered around his life, it would raise skepticism about the integrity and the purpose, the intent of these Gospels, if he was only mentioned 4 times and it mentioned Odin, and it mentioned if it mentioned Odin 427 times. So Jesus appears 4 times in the Gospels, but Odin appears 430 times. You'd go, is this a book about Odin? Who's this Jesus guy? Now, the Quran, supposedly a verbatim record of Allah's words, mentions Moses 136 times, Jesus 187, Mary 70, Muhammad is only named 4 times. So dozens of times more mentions of Moses and Jesus than Muhammad by name, right? And this is supposedly the messenger who delivered Allah's verbatim word. Now, why is there this discrepancy? Well, it's one of many discrepancies in the Quran. So is this a lack of significance of Muhammad's role? Did Allah forget, or is the Quran really about Jesus? We could also ask which version of Jesus, right? So could Muhammad and early Muslims have come across the Collyridians in Jordan who worshipped Mary? Your thoughts, Odon? I'm just throwing out a few ideas.
I have many.
There's a point I'm getting to. There's a point I haven't got yet. I'll get to that. Yeah.
There are two different points. The first one is about Muhammad. Actually, there are 5 mentions, 5 occurrences. There are 4 mentions of Muhammad or Mahmad and 1 of Ahmad. But there is also another one that is never quoted by Muslims. There is a Mahmadin in the Quran, Makam Mahmadin. I don't remember the exact
that's a Jewish word.
reference.
Yeah.
Now, there is a verse in the Quran with the MHMD root that is not understood as referring to Muhammad because it cannot be understood as such. And it tells us that the MHMD root, Mahmad, was not about Muhammad. it tells about a desired or cherished place, a makam, which, in my opinion, is a temple. According to the Islamic narrative, the Islamic reading, it's about Mecca, but I think it's about Jerusalem and its temple. And it tells us about the use of Muhammad in the 7th century. It did not refer to the prophet of Islam, but it referred to Jewish assertion about the temple. The temple is a Muhammad place, a place that is cherished, worshipped, precious to Jewish people. And it also refers to the Messiah himself. It refers to Jesus.
Desired one, yeah.
And because it refers to the Messiah, it can also, in a derived manner, refer to the precursors of the Messiah, the one who claimed the Messiah will come, who would be called Muhammad themselves. And I think the historical Muhammad, or the historical Muhammads, bore the Muhammad or Muhammad title because they saw themselves as precursors of the Messiah. They were announcing his coming. And even it might even be that some of them pretended to be the Messiah themselves. And besides, there is something very important about those Muhammad occurrences in the Quran. The 4 occurrences of Muhammad and the one of Ahmad are all interpolations. They were added in, they were not there in the original text. They were added eventually. We don't know. We can hypothesize that they were added in the 8th century, but not before. And this has been proven by Edouard Marie-Gallet in a conference and a paper that was published by the Inara Research Center, Inara School. So it's published in a peer-reviewed book.
Journal, yeah.
And the article is to be found also on his academia.edu page. It's in French, both in French and in English. And this is a very, very important discovery. It goes, it proves your point, Lloyd. The fact that Muhammad is only mentioned 4 times in the Quran is already very suspicious.
Right.
Very, very suspicious. But when you come to realize that those 4 occurrences,
titles, they're not references to a specific individual by name. They're not
actually,
pronouns.
They are. When they were added, because of this. But they were added in the Quran because they needed the Quran to assert the existence of the Prophet name.
It's not a proper name. It's actually a title referring to someone else, but they are repurposing it.
Yeah, exactly. They have repurposed the title to refer to their own creation, the creation of the Prophet of Islam. But it tells us something. What does it mean?
Points. Just remember though, Odon, that if we discuss each of these facts and details at length, this is going to take 5-6 episodes. It's not going to, so as long as we acknowledge that fact. Also, now remember the Quran claims that
I had another point. I told you I have 2 points. The other point is about the so-called Collyridians in Jordan, the cult that worship Mary. I think it's concordism. It's blunt concordism. It's about giving an Islamic explanation to the verse in, I think it's Surah 5, 116, when Jesus said to his Christian followers that they worshipped, that they shouldn't have worshipped him and his mother.
Yes, this is why I think
because of this verse, the Islamic narrative has developed the concordist, literalist idea that the Christians worship Mary as a goddess.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's false. And because it is false, because they cannot prove it, because it's not a mainstream Christian creed, they invented the existence of cults or very small movements in order to justify their concordist and literalist reading of the text. Whereas the text is not about Mary. The mother Jesus is speaking about in the verse, it's not Mary. The mother is the Holy Spirit.
Well, yeah, that takes us back to, but that would be a different episode on a different topic, but that takes us back to an earlier cult which inspired the Manichaeans, also a Gnostic group that inspired the Manichaeans. These ideas made their way directly into Islam. So look, Bill Sykes, first of all, what you're stating is not true. It is completely false. I don't believe it. I reject it 100% as a lie. And I believe that Orthodox practitioners who claim that the Orthodox Church comes before the Catholic Church have been lied to and are spreading a lie. They are simply lying, period. You may not like that, but that's the conclusion I've come to. This is a falsehood. I am not going to tolerate that. So if you want to remain in the channel, then you can let that one go, because I am simply just not going to cope with that. That is just as people have lied to me and been lied to about Martin Luther, who was a vile, disgusting, heretical, dishonest, warmongering pig of a man who was somehow, like Muhammad, turned into a great man of peace. Yeah, that's another bunch of lies I've dealt with, and I'll come back to that. But by the same token, there is something very, very off with this claim. Historically, it does not stand up. It is completely untrue. So let that go. Do not bring it up again. I will ban you. I really don't care. Okay, moving on. So this last point here was just a speculation, because, Odin, I was just thinking, where did they get this idea of Mary as part of the Trinity, right? So are they taking this idea from the Collyridians and then, exaggerating it, embellishing it, and saying, well, blah, that's what Christians think, because there's so much heretical content in the Quran that you're like, what's a little bit more, And then, okay, so now Griffiths, we're going to be here for 6 episodes at this rate. So Griffiths references several texts. The Gospel of Luke. Now, this is what the main crux of my argument here. The Gospel of Luke, the proto-evangelium of James, right? So there's the Diatessaron by Tatian, and in a footnote, the apocryphal Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, which includes the palm tree story of Mary found in Surah 19 of the Quran. Now, what is important of the palm tree story, this takes us back to just outside of Jerusalem on the way to Bethlehem, to the church of the Kathisma, the church of the seat of Mary, where according to legend, according to the Bible, on the way from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, they went, but according to further later legends, she sat down, she was tired, she was hot, she sat down on a rock halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and she wanted to drink. And of course, a spring, an angel, God caused the spring to come up, and she had water for her thirst. Now, of course, in the Quran, you have these, in the Muslim narrative, you have stories of a palm tree that feeds Mary. The palm tree bends down, gives her shade, gives her dates, and the spring. Now, these ideas come out of the proto-evangelium of James. They come out of Gnostic Gospels. But there's one more that's very important. Then I'll let you jump in. And this is why Muhammad is Jesus, and this, because you've got this story from the Proto-Evangelium of James that is directly linked to Mary. But here's a second one. The Quran alters details, like from Luke 1:34-35. So it misrepresents the Bible. It doesn't accurately represent the Bible or Christianity. So this raises big questions about the accuracy of the Quran. However, the Proto-Evangelium of James is non-canonical. It's what, 4th century. And it is Gnostic, and it depicts Jesus as being born from Mary as a beam of bright light rather than a normal birth. In other words, there's this bright light that floods this cave, and then suddenly after the light disappears, boom, there's Jesus. Now, what is crazy is if you go through the Sirah of Muhammad, if you go through the Sirah, you read the Gospels of Muhammad, the biographies, as they call them, of Muhammad. Muhammad is born after a massive ray of light shines out of his mother's vajayjay, 1,200 kilometers all the way to Syria. So these parallels are crazy, because now you've got more than one direct parallel taken straight out of a Gnostic gospel, talking about Jesus, talking about Mary and the virgin birth, and the Islamic narrative has now copied more than one instance of this. And in this case, they are specifically referring to Jesus, and now Muhammad has exactly the same characteristic. In this case, for me, Muhammad is Jesus. Over to you, Odon.
There are other Gnostic gospels and that are referenced in the Quran. There is a Gnostic gospel of Thomas also. But I want to pinpoint something here that is very, very interesting. If you look at the Gospel of Luke in Aramaic, it depicts the nativity, the birth of Jesus in how do you say it? Is put by Mary in a mangeoire, a manger.
A manger.
A manger, mangeoire en français. We call it a crèche. Yeah, it's a nativity scene. But if you look at the words in Aramaic, manger, if you pronounce the ya at the end of the word, it becomes light of God.
Wow.
And this is something very interesting, because when the angels tell the shepherds in the hills, there is a sign. The sign is a child in a manger. It's a very odd sign.
Child of light.
It's a child which is hallowed in divine light. It can be understood that because Aramaic is a very profound language with play on words, lots of plays on the words, and we have two meanings for the expression manger, a very simplistic manger, and also divine light. And this could explain why the proto-evangelium of James talks about Jesus being born from the light. And it could also explain why the Arabs knew about this story, because they had been Christianized by Aramaic-speaking Christians. And so they might have known the double meaning of the expression manger.
Right. And in
this
Jerusalem,
will
they would have
explain
come
why
across it as well.
Excuse me.
And in Jerusalem, they would have come across it as well.
Yeah, exactly. And this would also explain why centuries after the forgers of the Sirah invented the story about Muhammad. They were just copying the Christian traditions. But they copied many Christian traditions for Muhammad. Muhammad is also multiplying food like Jesus did.
He does many miracles in the Sirah. I mean, water comes out of his fingers, you know.
Exactly.
He splits a rock.
He's a sort of a new Jesus for Islam.
Yeah. I mean, both of these myths are a specific reference to Jesus. Muhammad has exactly that same myth, effectively, and it's clear that this refers to Jesus. Maybe a distorted version, but that is really just what that means. Okay, let's try and move on at a pace. Let's go another 10 or 15 minutes max. So, are the Quraysh pagans? Are they mushrikūn? The Quraysh are referred to as mushrikūn in the context of the Quran, right? People who ascribe partners to God, who are worshipped multiple deities alongside the God of Abraham, known as Allāh, right? Now, of course, we know that multiple deities could be separate deities, completely distinct from the creator God, or they could be parts of, aspects of, creations of, who are effectively our God, which is not a Christian concept. It's definitely not a monotheistic concept, but to these people, that's 100% all good. The Quran addresses the beliefs and practices of the Quraysh, highlighting their veneration of lesser deities and their association of partners, which is a central theme in the polemics against idolatry. So a couple of Quran verses. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm going to breeze through, right? So it says that do not attribute to Allah equals while you know that there is nothing similar to him. Okay, that also tells us that Allah is nothing like creation, but we know from a Christian point of view, God made creation, and creation is a reflection of God's character and characteristics. So this already is a dichotomy with the Christian and Muslim view. So not the God of Abraham. The verse emphasizes the oneness of God, warns against associating partners, which is supposedly the practice among the Quraysh, who worshipped idols, which would also, that's crazy that this description of pagans would also match Christians, right, Odon?
Yeah, I fully agree.
So it's really odd that you can actually come to the conclusion that it's Christians when they're talking about total pagans. It kind of makes no sense, but there you go. Welcome to the Quran. Okay, do not insult those they invoke other than Allah, lest they insult Allah in anger without knowledge. Okay, so we are ignorant. Okay, and so there's a handful of verses. I'm not going to go into all of these, but we rely on idols that hold no power. So for them, it's a holy duty to not have us recite this blasphemy. So for Muslims, it's blasphemy. That's what they're saying, right?
Yeah. If you look at Surah 3, at your point 3, Surah 16,
Yep.
the one they are invoking are dead people. They are like corpses lying in the grave. They are saints, holy figures from the past.
Right. It's crazy, these allusions to, it's like sometimes it takes the figurative and makes it literal, and sometimes it takes the literal and makes it figurative. It's some kind of transformation they take, yeah?
And besides, when you look at the text and the numerous references you provided, you see that we have different stances towards so-called idolaters. Sometimes they are harshly condemned, and sometimes they are to be condemned, but not too harshly, because we have to befriend them and we have to play nice with them, because maybe they can be useful. And so you see here that the Quran is not about a grand statement about polytheism or paganism or even Christianity. It's something very circumstantial, pertaining to historical events, actual events in the 7th century. And depending on these events, there might have been a stance towards a harsh condemnation or a different stance.
Yeah, it seems if that was written at a later time, then they had a later view, and that view made its way into the book 200 years later. So, once they had dominance, once they had political power, once they had military strength. So, yeah, there's
a way of explaining a text that did not understand.
Yeah. What we do get, remember, I'm kind of paraphrasing Crone here. She's saying that of these Quraysh, some of these members adopted beliefs that blurred the lines between monotheism and polytheism. Now remember, they've already got a mistaken view of polytheism. They're referring to things that are not polytheistic as polytheism. They're simply just lumping it in there. But there may be truth in that. You've got, let's say these are Messianic Jews, or these are heretical Christians or Gnostics or something that have let's say a pseudo-biblical flavor to them, but they seem to have a syncretic set of beliefs that blurs monotheism and some potentially pagan ideas. So the Quran emphasizes very strongly uniqueness and sovereignty of God, and it goes against people who deviate from that. So there seems to be potentially a deviance from that. Now, look, you can point it at Christians, granted, you can. And she does mention that. But there might be other groups as well, because she lumps in a whole bunch of people into the Quran lumps a bunch of different groups potentially into the bag called polytheism without much distinction. It doesn't make great distinctions. So there's inconsistency and lack of clarity in the Quran when it discusses idolatry, right? The idols in the Kaaba, we've already discussed that. You'd not guess from the Quran that the Kaaba had a bunch of idols. That is all part of the hadiths and the seerah and all of the other literature around it, right? The narrative around it. And there's a failure to confront the idolatrous practices, or they didn't exist in that time. And the use of the terms tagut may be metaphorical rather than literal. She mentions this. So the Quran's references to idols may not capture the complexity. Well, put it this way, let's just simplify. Maybe they're referring to Christians who believe in the Trinity rather than actual idols. And they've just exaggerated that narrative. Odon.
Yeah, they believe in the Trinity, exactly. I think you're right. And they also believed in saints and holy figures. And I think it is also referred to in the Quran. It's not on the shirk is not only about is not only about the Trinity, but it's also about holy figures, saints, corpses lying in the graves. But it's also about holy figures in monasteries, giving one's daughters to a monastery, for example, where they will consecrate themselves to God.
That these idols function exactly the same way as saints do in Christianity, which backs up your point again. She now affirms your point.
Yeah, I agree. There is something that is referred to in the Islamic narrative as an idolatrous practice, which is not. It is about giving some of the crops to the deity. It's not about literally. It's not about giving the crops to as a sacrifice to a pagan divinity. It's giving part of the crop to a monastery or to a church as a good deed.
Mm-hmm.
You see, as an offering, but not as a sacrifice to a deity, to a pagan deity.
Wow. So it misrepresents that as well in tithing.
Yeah, it's part of the exaggeration.
Right.
And the slandering.
Right. Yeah. Excellent points. I mean, so hopefully the audience is starting to see there's multiple strands. I'm trying to present all of them. There's also multiple streams of thought by different scholars. I'm trying to present various of these, but to show you that there's a range of thought here, but also I'm trying to give you all of these and then we can hopefully try to start making distinctions and start separating one line of thinking from another, one strand, one narrative strand from another, so that we can start to make clear distinctions and then start eliminating or identifying. So the Quran and paganism, right? So the Quran doesn't acknowledge idols. Okay. Now here's the thing. So Muhammad in the Quran at least doesn't engage with idolatrous practices. So there was no idolatrous practice at the time, it seems, or in that place at least. And right, nor does he threaten their destruction, which would be expected if these practices were a central concern. The absence of these is very telling. So the Quran's portrayal of the Quraysh and their beliefs do not align with the historical realities of idolatry. If idolatry were real at that time to that degree, then there's a disconnect between the text and the religious landscape. Otherwise, we're talking about believers who believe in maybe a trinity, as we've been discussing. And the ultimate conclusion is that the mushrikūn were not straightforward pagans. They cannot be in the traditional sense. They worship the same God as the messenger. They refer to him as Allāh, and they recognize him as a high deity, which already is a very strong parallel for pagans to have almost exactly the same theology as these monotheists. That's very unusual. That really doesn't make sense. So this religious identity blends elements of monotheism with the veneration of intermediary figures. You can say Christianity, Catholic Christian practice, similar to practices in late antique religious contexts. So we can begin to conclude that this could just be a condemnation of Christianity, could also be a condemnation of potentially some heretical groups, or both. Your thoughts, hold on, before I move on. We'll do another one slide more maybe.
There is another argument to be made. If you take the Islamic narrative, the Nazarenes are supposed to be Christians. There are only 14 occurrences of the Nazarene or Nasrani expression in the text. In a vast, the environment is almost 95% Christian.
Right.
How can this be? There are almost no references to Christianity in the Quran, according to the Islamic narrative. There is something wrong here. It talks about Jewish figures. It talks about Jesus, but it almost never talks about Christians. It's because the mushrikuns are Christians.
Yes, I want to mention something though, because I don't want to make too many firm conclusions, because I think there's still room for a little bit of inquiry and refinement. But this came out a couple of days ago. This is only a few days old. It says October 9th. So this is I follow the Biblical Archaeology Society. I subscribe to them. I have to resubscribe again. These guys do some amazing work. And I mean, look, there are scholars, obviously, that are very left-leaning, very liberal, and they talk absolute nonsense, and you just ignore those guys. But they do present some great information. The information is great. The interpretation is just terrible, useless, worse than useless. But that said, this is on Jews in pre-Islamic Arabia. Now, I'll mention this without wanting to cause a big fight, but Jay Smith once said something on a different channel about me, because he didn't say my name, but he was referring to me because I'd said there was the presence of Jews in Arabia. And he was saying, no, that never happened. There wasn't a single Jew, not for a million miles. The nearest Jews were on Mars. Yes, I'm exaggerating, but effectively that was the point. Now, a couple of months later, archaeology is showing that apparently there was a Jewish diaspora, and this is the early days of these discoveries. And there are archaeological sites, there are inscriptions that refer to Jews, and so far they've examined this area, and there's definitely a presence of Jews in this area. And this starts to get reasonably close to, it's in the Hejaz, and it's getting very close to Mecca. So which means there would have been trade going through here, there would have been some kind of conversation, some kind of traditions being shared. So, and they mention here terms like rabbi, and they mention names of people, Honi and Samuel, inscriptions are Hebrew names. So we've gone from, there wasn't a single Jew on the planet. In fact, the Jews had taken spaceships and gone to Mars, and therefore Lloyd is wrong about Jews in Arabia, to archaeology showing, yeah, definitely the Jews were all over the place in Arabia. So just thought I'd mention that. So pre-Islamic Arabia became home to a sizable Jewish diaspora, it says here. So yeah, the evidence. Now, also at the time, just to clarify, I was referencing a paper by someone else who said it. I didn't say that I believed it. I said the paper says that. The author of the paper said that. That wasn't my claim. I was assuming that's what's written in the page, on the page. But fine and well. But anywho, so yeah, so they mentioned they moved to Tema, and before the Bar Kokhba revolt. So but these are actual inscriptions. These are actual tomb inscription from Tema Oasis. Isaiah, the counselor, son of Joseph, the mayor of Tema. So you had Jews in Arabia, and therefore the Jewish narrative was present in Arabia. Your thoughts on that, Odon? I think we can end here.
I don't know why J. Smith made this claim about the Jews never having been in Arabia. I think it's very common.
He made a specific reference to me because I'd referenced something about the Sharia, and the Sharia had come from the Jews, and there were Jews present in northern Arabia that they got this information from. And he said, well, the claim is false. There were thousands of Jews there, and like blah, blah, whatever. Anyway, long story. So Jay and I can fight over that another time.
The thing with ancient Judaity, they were dispersed among every trade route in the known world. And there was a very old trade route, the caravan route, going from Yemen to Petra and then to the Mediterranean Sea. With halting sites at Taif, Yathrib, and so on. And it seems only natural to think that Jews were there.
Yeah,
they were everywhere. They were in every port, in every halting sign, in the caravan routes. So why wouldn't they have been in Arabia?
Yeah.
Besides,
and this is Saudi Arabia. Look how green this is.
I seem to remember that in the Acts of the Apostle, in the Pentecost passage, there is a reference to Persians, Elamites, and people from all around the world coming to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage, so Jews. And I think there is a mention to Jews from Arabia there.
Yeah, there's an Aramaic tomb inscription written in Nabatean at Tema. And I mean, this is crazy. So there definitely was this. And yeah, so there was a long-standing presence of Jews in the 2nd century. At least we can trace it as far back as that in this region. So just to say, so we've got reason to think that yes, it's referring to Jews, referring to maybe Messianic Jews. So we definitely have that. Then later on, I can talk about
Yemen was once a Jewish kingdom before Islam.
That is also true. And yeah, and I mean, look how green this is. Look at the greenness of this.
Arabia Felix. Where is it?
This is North Arabia, I believe. At Al-Ula, yeah. No, so sort of northern areas, yeah.
Yeah, Arabia can be green.
4th century local diaspora, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So look, I think, should we end it here? I mean, I might do another stream tomorrow. Wow, Ailbeer, thank you. Become a member. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. So yeah. So there's more. We've done 25 slides. And I think I've got a bunch more, a few more. But would you like to start your slides on Saturday or continue with these? You continue the conversation. Or do them in parallel. I mean, alternate or something.
As you want. My proposition was to look at the Jews and the Nazarenes in the literal Quranic text. So it kind of complements the Mushrikun presentation. So we can do we can do it. Oh, come on.
Yeah, this was my last slide that I was going to do on this topic and end here and move to part 2. So I was going to move to a different set of slides after this, but I wanted to end this part of it, you know. But shall we do that next time, or just finish this slide?
Okay, let's finish it. Let's finish it.
So
we'll do the Jews and Nazarene afterwards.
Okay, so look, I do apologize to those whom I've upset. I did my Luther series that really annoyed people, but honestly, as a Protestant, coming to the topic of Luther, having heard so many stories and having bought the entire Luther's works and started reading it over a couple of years, over 3 years or something, I came to the conclusion that Luther was a sick bastard who nobody in his right mind would consider to be remotely holy, except mentally ill, violent, and utterly immorally depraved. That was the conclusion I came to, not because I didn't know who Luther was. I just knew our church is founded by Luther, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, read Luther, disgusting man. Same thing, story with the Orthodox. I've heard so many stories and I have my doubts, and I do not accept the story that is told. Moving on. So I do apologize for upsetting people, but those are stands I take, and that's that. That's just how it is. I believe the facts do not support that story, and I'm not going to pander to that. And if it loses subscribers, that's how it is. Okay, now onto my point here. Onto my point. Islam and the stone. Remember I mentioned that some of these people have this idea that if they're busy licking Frank's stone, you know, if they're licking Willie's hard parts, that they are kind of still worshiping Frank. You know what I'm saying? You got Frank, the main god up here, the high god, and you've got Willie, who lives on Earth because the high god has got dementia or whatever, and he's buggered off and no one's seen him for centuries. Well, you know, they've got this idea that you've got the high god, but he's busy. You know, he's running the universe, really busy, doesn't have time for us. But we've got Willie right here, and we can give Willie a good lick. We can pray to Willie. We can rub ourselves up against Willie. We can fondle Willie. We can touch Willie. That's what they literally do. It's not idolatry, even though they will literally say that these other people who did exactly the same thing are idolaters and pagans, which is crazy. They're doing precisely the same things as hypocrites and claiming that those guys are pagan, but we are not. Because, you see, Willie over here, the Kaaba, is not a separate deity. It is Allah. It's Allah on earth. It's a part of Allah. It's an aspect of Allah. It's a piece of Allah that's connected to Allah. So therefore, it's not idolatry. But if you did it, well, you're a pagan. It's completely hypocritical. Any comment on that before I just get to the last couple of paragraphs of the slide?
Yeah, it really, if every decent person would think of this as a pagan practice. But if there are other practices, there were other practices at Mecca during the pilgrimage that are also from a pagan origin. I'm referring here to the stoning of the devil. In the 20th century, the Saudis replaced the stones that were stoned. But before this replacement, the stone looked very much like a linguam, which is an erect penis in the Eastern culture.
From India. Yeah,
from India and so on. And it's really, you just have to look at the Wikipedia page, Stoning of the Devil, and you will get a picture of the old stone from 1942. And it's exactly the same thing as the Lingwam tradition. Just look at the two Wikipedia pages, Lingwam and Stoning of the Devil.
Yeah, no, I agree fully there. So understand.
And if you look also at the shape of the silver casing of the black stone, it's also very, very similar to the yoni tradition.
Yes,
The yoni
100%.
it complements the lingwam. The lingwam is the penis, and the yoni in the Indian tradition is the female genitalia. And really, it looks like this. And when you look at people such as this guy licking the black stone inside of a yoni thing, it's really...
Yeah, this looks like a clitoris. Just to, without putting too big a, but notice he's praying to the holy vajayjay here. So understand, this is a pagan practice. This is not a messianic Jewish practice. This is not a Christian practice. There is paganism present. I think it's fair to say these are pagan practices that somehow have been syncretized. It's a soup. Put it this way: it's like putting salt in your tea. It makes no sense, but that's what syncretism is. They smash together things that don't fit, don't match, do not belong. But what the heck? Here they go, and off they go, and they do it. Logically speaking, Westerners, academics, thinkers like ourselves, educated people, we wouldn't think that way. We would reject that. However, third worlders don't abide by those rules. So we have paganism present. We have, I believe, is it fair to say we have some genuine paganism present in Islam, Odon?
I think so. But you see, the evidence for pagan influence is material here. It is the yoni shape of the silver casing. It is the shape of the lingwam shape of the devil stone.
Yeah.
But the worship you see here, the guy licking the stone and pressing themselves to the Kaaba, it might be just the frenzy of the cult when they are all together in Mecca performing the pilgrimage and so on. There is a frenzy developing there, and you can
but remember, they believe that this stone gives them salvation. They believe it erases their sins, that only Allah can do. Only God can do that. So therefore, this stone is God. By that logic, the stone is God.
It's only logical that they do this. It's only logical, but the real pagan stuff, it's the material stuff. It's the black stone. It's the silver casing. Those are really from a pagan background.
So just want to say then, the point is that there is a pagan remnant, there's a pagan memory, and there's certainly a pagan element in Islam. It came from somewhere. Now, so it's not just Christians and Jews. There's some whack job paganism in there too. Okay, last slide. Not merely idolaters. Is there deception going on? That's just a speculation. So the Quran critiques mushrikun practices, particularly associationism, which we call shirk or partnership. But it does not depict mushrikun as entirely rejecting a monotheistic God. So this suggests the mushrikun were influenced by biblical traditions. Yet we just saw the paganism, which tells us there's a syncretism. They are combining or merging different contradictory forms of belief or practice and going, yeah, this contradiction works just fine. So they may have identified the, at the time, pagan Allah, at least according to narrative. Allah was Baal. Baal is in the Bible. Baal is Hubal. Hubal was in the Kaaba, the main god of the Kaaba. So the pagan Allah with the God of the Jews, which clearly wouldn't jibe with the Christian, biblical, Jewish, with the biblical view, right? So this reflects a form of monotheism that was distinct from traditional paganism and from monotheistic faith of Jews and Christians. This is another evidence of syncretism. You're merging a pagan deity with the Christian God. It's like saying that God is the equivalent of Zeus. no, it wouldn't work for us, but it works for them. The final conclusion of Patricia Crone's paper, The Religion of the Qur'ānic Pagans, God, and the Lesser Deities, puts forward the idea that the mushrikūn, the polytheists, as they call us, addressed in the Quran, held a belief system that recognized the same God as the messenger while venerating lesser deities or angels. Now, is this the same as the above? Like, no, there's similarities, there's contradictions. Is it two different groups, or is it a group that held both beliefs at the same time, as illogical and incongruent as that may be? These lesser beings functioning like saints in Islamic and later and Christian traditions. Now, again, you've got this Christian parallel. You've got, as Odin has mentioned. So are we dealing with different things, or is it one group that has combined these things, try to mix them, even though they don't work, but there you go? Or are they talking about different groups at different times, different groups at the same time? Things to think about. So there's a mitigated monotheism where the pagans saw themselves as worshipping God alone, albeit through intermediaries. So remember I spoke of the projection in the beginning earlier, that the voice, the narrator in the Quran, is doing projection. He's telling the Jews and the Christians, or he's telling the Christians, you guys are pagans because of the above, right? But here you've got a mitigated monotheism where the pagans saw themselves as worshipping Allah alone, albeit by licking the Kaaba. That's the point.
It's not in the Quran. The black stone or the licking of the Kaaba is not in the Quran.
Yeah, I know the licking is not instructed, but the thing is, it matches the practice that Crone identifies with this mitigated monotheism. It's a mixture, a syncretism of paganism and monotheism.
I think it's an anachronism. This practice is developed afterwards. I think so.
Maybe they revived old pagan practices because they didn't want to let go of them because they were culturally so entrenched.
Let me be clear. There was no Kaaba at the time of Muhammad. There was no Mecca, actually. The Kaaba that is referred to in the Quranic text is the temple in Jerusalem.
Go back to Yemen. Go back to Eastern Africa. Then you're talking those practices that were previously present being revived and included into this new religion, syncretized, even though they don't belong. And there you go.
I agree. Those practices existed. They worship stones. They worship the white stone, the black stone, and so on before Islam. But it doesn't mean that the mushrikūn and the practices that are described in the Quran are about this. You see, you make a connection here. Okay, it's an hypothesis, but there might be other hypotheses for the polytheistic practices that are described in the Quran. And I don't think they refer to licking the black stone and so on.
No. I'm saying here, she talks of mitigated monotheism. My conclusion is we can see mitigated monotheism by saying we're monotheists and we're going to lick that stone. The two are completely contradictory. They're clearly a pagan practice and a monotheistic practice. And they're going, this is mitigated. She said this mitigated monotheism was supposedly an attribute of the mushrikūn. Here we're seeing it's actually an attribute of the Muslims. So hence I was saying, well, if it's an attribute of the Muslims and it's not an attribute of the Christians, then somebody was projecting onto the Christians their own acts.
Yeah. Interesting idea. A projection, yeah. You have to already know the practice to attribute it to others.
Yeah. So they're saying, no, you worshipping Jesus or having a Trinity, that's paganism. Us licking this stone here, that's all good. That's not pagan, even though those pagans used to do it. It's hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's a form of hypocrisy, but it's the same when you look at, for example, censorship in Iran. There were mullahs that censored Western magazines, and they saw sex and tits and feminine curves everywhere, and they put black on everything. It's because they had everything in their mind already.
Yeah, well, so hopefully that makes some sense. I mean, logically it makes sense, but hopefully you might see there's a projection. This mitigated monotheism, right, where the pagans saw themselves as worshipping God alone, but through intermediaries. that makes no sense to our minds. But we worship to God, right? We pray to God, but they have the black stone, which can take away their sins. So the black stone, only God can take away sins, not an object, not the creation cannot do that, but they claim it can because the creation is God to them. That is mitigated monotheism that they were accusing the Christians of, the Mushrikun of. Here you've got these Muslims doing exactly that because they are the ones who are guilty of mitigated monotheism. They are the pagans who've combined and syncretized, and yet they're projecting and accusing us of it. That's kind of the final conclusion here. So you've got a weird blend of biblical monotheism with ancient pagan practices, which they've retained, revived, and included somehow. At least, yeah. So I'll leave it at that. Odon, give you the last word, and we'll call it a night. Christians don't pray to Jesus by Maria. That's intercession. There's a different in term. There's reverence, intercession, different terms, different concepts. Anyway, yeah. Last word to you, Odon.
I very much like your title, not merely idolaters, a deception. Because this is what this Mushrikun stuff is about. It's a deception. The Mushrikun, in my opinion, in the Quran, were Christians. Maybe not Orthodox Christians and so on. So, all right, we agree on this, right? And the deception is the invention by the Islamic narrative that these Mushrikuns were pagans. And this was essential to Islam. Islam needed a pagan background as a sort of blank page on which it could write its own history, its own revelation. Without paganism, without a pagan background, Islam could not exist. Islam would not be legit. So they had to invent a pagan background, and they had to make do with the text they had, which is the Quran. The Quran was not talking about paganism, was talking about Mushrikun as being Christians, but then the Islamic narrative forced a new interpretation upon the text and forced Muslim to believe that the Quraysh were pagans, that Mecca was a pagan environment, and so on. But it's all
I think they're trying to redefine Christians as pagans and redefine paganism so that they're not pagan.
Yeah, because the text does not fit the Islamic narrative. Unconsciously, Muslims tend to recognize it. And because of this, in a second time, or maybe a third time, they invented the idea that because Christians worship Jesus, they are sort of pagans. So in the end, it all comes together, and the Quranic text is right.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, I think we agree on a lot of things. We might argue about slight definitions or just terminology, but I mean, on the whole, we seem to. This is just different information or additional information or clarification of things just to try to flesh this out. Because I'm going through multiple strands. I'm saying this scholar thinks A, scholar thinks B, this scholar thinks C. Let's figure this out. And the Quran has this whole confusion. Can we unwrap this thing? Can we identify distinct threads and ideas here? And that's what I've been doing. That's what I'm trying to do. And I mean, I agree. I think we agree on like 99% of things here. Hold on. No,
I think so.
Just coming from different angles and different directions at the same target.
I think so.
Yeah. I mean, because I thought, I mean, the very first episode, I thought you were going to come down on me from a great height and leave a smoking crater in the ground when you were done with me.
No, you've read my book. You know what I think. We agree on most things. The only thing I already talked about this is that I don't see religion as you seem to present it. I don't see religion as a belief in a God, a one God, many gods, as an opposition between monotheism or polytheism or lesser deities and so on. All those are abstractions. That's not what really counts for a believer.
Remember, I'm paraphrasing Crone's paper. I'm kind of rewriting or paraphrasing her paper. You know, so it's...
I agree. But what I wanted to the point I wanted to make is that what really matters for a believer is not that there is one God or two gods or three gods or we are monotheists or so on. Those are this is not the issue. The issue is salvation. What gives me salvation? Does God grant me direct salvation? How will I be saved? Is it through Jesus' intercession, or by doing stuff with Jesus and so on? This is what's really at stake here. And because we tend to see things with abstractions like monotheism, polytheism, and so on, we miss the main point. And especially in Islam, Islam has a concept of salvation as not going to hell and going to paradise instead.
Right.
But it does not present itself as a religion of salvation, and it does not put the hell and paradise stuff as its central element. Its central element is supposedly Tawhid, monotheism, pure monotheism. But it's all a sort of deception, because the main thing in Islam, it's not about monotheism. It's about salvation, like in every other religion. And if you want to understand Islam, you have to look at its salvation proposition. What's the salvation Islam proposes?
That's,
so it's about
that's worth taking on a different. That's a topic on its own. I mean, how they view the afterlife, salvation, death, and all that. I mean, that's actually worth. So let's actually do that as a separate discussion, as a breakout. Shall we do this again on Saturday?
No, it's also very relevant to our mušrikūn.
So let's
let me just give me 1 minute, just 1 minute. Salvation
59,
is about
58.
Okay. Salvation is about getting rid from.
It wasn't me. Odon just dropped off the stream, guys. I'll text him and ask him where he went.
Still there? Do you still hear me?
Yeah, you just disappeared off the stream. I don't know what happened. Was not me.
Okay. No. The point I wanted to make is salvation is not just about going to paradise or not going to hell. This is a very simplist way of putting things. Salvation is about getting rid from evil. And when the salvation proposition of the literal Quran is about getting rid from the mushrikun. This is something interesting. The mushrikun are part of evil. They are evildoers, such as the Jews and almost everyone, according to the Quran. And it gives us another way of seeing the religion that developed in early Islam, and how Islam developed thereafter. But like you said, it's material for other presentations.
Yeah, because look, I mean, I've gone 27 pages in 4 hours. We're going to be here for a while discussing each of the details that I'm presenting. I mean, there's a lot to be unpacked. I mean, I'm just trying to focus on one thing, more or less, but there is so much here, and I mean, it needs to be discussed, because there's so many potential meanings or interpretations, and we've got to try and narrow it down. But look, on Saturday, shall we do your slides or continue with mine? I mean, or should we pick yours up on Saturday? We can do yours.
I thought we agreed we continued on yours.
Can we do that? It's up to you. I mean, I'll let you decide. If you're ready. Then we take something new, and we can always carry this on next week again.
All right.
But guys, thank you very much, everyone. I hope it's been entertaining, despite my my obstreperousness here and there. But thank you all. God bless, guys. Take care.